He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and first things first, I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and New Year's, full of good food, friends, family. The world is certainly in a bit of a bind right now with all the craziness, so these happy moments, albeit brief, are absolutely welcomed, and I hope you guys all got to indulge in some good times. There are a lot of things developing lately, from cryptids to UFO, UAPs, and it's proving really hard to keep up, and on top of all of that, we have the world of AI and generated imagery that is not helping us very well work closer towards solving or even learning more about what these mysterious things are in the world. But through all of that, there are still things happening with bits of history and truth to them that we can examine and use to help form our own perspectives and shed a little bit more light on things as we keep moving forward. Now remember, you can find us online via our social media channels. And additionally, you can reach us directly via cryptidclues@gmail.com. So for today's episode, I spoke with a couple individuals and had some really good conversations about just the stigma and the sightings associated with Sasquatch. Now, where we are today holds a very real problem for it. Now, I've mentioned this before on the show, but there are so many negative outlets that just, I don't want to say pride because that's me insinuating it, but I'm going to use the word regardless. They pride themselves on these sorts of topics, and sadly, they get the better of innocent folks, in my opinion, who may or may not have had a real experience, but the outcome is the same regardless. You have a news anchor share the story, the cameras show the area of the sighting, and the witness puts in his 2 cents, but ultimately you have the media giving a little slight smile or a chuckle at the end of it, and they just kind of like play it off as if they're addressing youth or adolescent. It's like Boy Who Cried Wolf. Now, I understand the media has to maintain their line of reliability and credibility. While it's not for me to decide how questionable that may be these days, the stigma exists at all levels, from small reporters to larger corporations, and that funnels out to regular folks out there, which in turn makes it hard for individuals that experience these unknown things to share, not just with their friends, but also family. So to have family and friends that can listen or maybe even relate is wonderful. Now, you should never have to feel alone or bury your experience deep down where it eats at you, because these things are incredible, sometimes terrifying and scary, but most people go through life never having anything like this happen. So in a weird way, it's sort of like winning a lottery. But of course, there are people that experience these things and say, you know what, I would never want to have that happen again. Totally justified. It's reasonable to say. Now, because, the truth, even though billions go through life never ever knowing this or seeing these things, finding this truth for themselves, that's why I kind of relate it to like winning the lottery. Because if you have an experience like this, that's pretty lucky. And then in your heart what you saw, and it changes you as a person. It changes how you view things in life, and that's pretty incredible. It really, really is. But I digress. That's me going a little philosophical. So now, these individuals that I spoke to, they shared these experiences, and I cannot thank them enough. And I hope these experiences do provide some insight to those forming their own perspectives as well, or just offer some comfort to those who've experienced things and are just seeking to relate to others. So our first experience, and I quote, "My grandpa's story I got secondhand from my great-grandma, his mother-in-law, my mom's grandma. And I could tell the importance to her was conveying the danger of these creatures, especially to children. To us. Now, we were around 7, 8 maybe when I was first told about them. Basically, he was working out in his field. Now, he kept some livestock, and I believe he was doing work with or around them. And it was getting later in the day. He was all of a sudden hit with a feeling of dread being watched, and a few moments later, he smelled the most god-awful foul odor he'd smelled. When he looked around, he saw Bigfoot in the tree line watching him. Now, apparently, he dropped everything he was doing, jumped in his truck to get out of there. Now, Grandma, we called her Grandma, but this was my great-grandma, said that he was fortunate enough to notice and get out of there instead of continuing to work, which I guess would have led him closer to that tree line. Now, she stressed to us many times that children in the woods at night could get taken by Bigfoot. And he would. I hesitate to even say this because at the surface it feels silly, but she was very serious and seemed scared when saying it. Twist your head off of your body. Now, my mom's story was similar and happens probably a decade later and maybe a mile away from where my grandpa's encounter happened. Now, Mom saw 2 Bigfoots, what appeared to be a mother and a baby, when she was walking to her car. A similar story, except she smelled them first and then felt the dread being watched feeling. And she described the smell as a mix between feces and rotting meat and said it was thick in the air, which I always found interesting because smells usually didn't affect her much. And she quickly got in her car, and when she looked back up, they were gone. She sat in the car waiting for a while and then got out to go to where they were. She apparently saw one footprint, the larger of the 2, so the mother, but couldn't find any more of them. This was long before smartphones, and we'd always been too poor for cameras. I do remember how incredibly shaken up she was over it. And as a little kid, seeing your mom that scared definitely sticks with you. And apparently not long after this, she caught one staring in the window. Now, I didn't see it, but her scream made my blood run cold, and maintained eye contact with her for almost a full minute as she described it. We were upstairs and ran down when she screamed, so it was probably a little less than a full minute, but to her, I'm sure it felt like an eternity. End quote. These things, taking quick little glances and peering in through windows in more remote locations, it's consistent, and they just, I don't know whether they're just trying to see if anyone's actually inside or they want to get inside. It's something that we don't have an answer for. Now, there are many things to note here that we can affiliate with other encounters, from the smell to the Bigfoot child obsession and how these creatures, like I said, like to observe for whatever reason that may be. This individual's retellings of these encounters, there's a rich culture behind them in a way that existed for a very, very long time. Before settlers came along, I can only imagine the stories and experiences that have been lost over generations regarding these creatures. So it's very wonderful to find recent experiences, albeit a generation or 2 ago. It's definitely scary, and I think, too, you have to remind yourself that, well, these things are amazing, and like I said before, we talked about this encounter, you need to make sure that you have precaution, because while these things are life-changing and wonderful, they are still wild and intelligent, and we don't know what their intentions are, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that's me. I'm putting forward my own perspective on that. To each his own, for sure. But not knowing what something's intention is, and that something being a predator, makes it a lot more scary. It's kind of like when you're dealing with something in a horror movie, and once you see it, it kind of reduces its scare factor, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Now, of course, you could be dealing with a ghost, and that ghost could be invisible, and that's a different kind of scare factor. But when you're dealing with something where you can't actually see it, and it leaves it up to your interpretation, that's where real fear can be. So if you know that something is there, you know that something is watching you, but you don't know Bigfoot, you don't maybe believe in Bigfoot, but you see this thing and you don't know what it is, and then your fear is going to kick in because your mind is starting to put things together. You feel that fear of being watched. You smell something very terrifying. And those two together mixing in with your own imagination, it's just a whole can of worms that can lead to something very, very scary. But best thing you can do, get out of that situation, leave, don't stick around too long. So there you go. Now, our next encounter is a memory, one that she decided to share, and that segues into a sighting, an experience that her father had had prior. And I quote, I'll make this short if I can. I'm a 30-year-old female, and I tell this story a lot, but I haven't shared it lately, so here it goes. When I was 12, I attended church with another girl my age, and we eventually became close friends. One evening, she invited me to spend the night, and for context, she lived on a horse farm outside of town, 3 huge fields. One behind her house with a barn where the stable was, one across the road of her house where they ran the horses, and one to the right of that field, which they didn't use much, but it had a back area that was kind of marshy and a lot of wooded area too, so we weren't allowed back there. The first night goes fine. We stayed playing Barbies and horses and snacking on junk food. The next day, after lunch, she offers for us to go ride her horse. So we put on our helmets and she led and I held on to her. Now her dad warned us about the backyard area, yada, 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 and we went off into the field. Rode around for close to an hour and we're passing the tree line to the marshy area. Now we were already too far away and we're thirsty, so she turned us around and it happened fast. The horse kicked up off the ground, front legs, and bucked us off, both. I hit the ground so hard and the horse took off. So we gather ourselves and look around and we make eye contact with a huge, hairy creature above us in a tree. I'm talking a gorilla type huge. The hair was matted and black, but also brownish in areas. Kinda looked dusty maybe. And his eyes were dark and sunken and piercing through my soul. And he was standing on a tree branch, probably 9-12 feet above us. Think oak tree. But it was winter, so there were no leaves. Now, I remember being so frozen with fear, and I tried screaming but couldn't. And I remember the pungent, breath-stealing stench in the air, like rotting meat and wet dog. So my friend grabbed my arm, and we started running. We ran for our lives, and I looked back multiple times, and it just watched us the whole time. Now, we came across her horse not far from us, stuck in the marshy gunk. It was like quicksand. And we pulled on her reins for forever, but eventually, we finally got her out. It was stressful because we didn't want to leave the horse, and we didn't want to be in trouble for riding by the marsh, but I was scared to be there, and I wanted to go back to get her dad to come, but we freed her ourselves miraculously. It was a long walk back to her house, but I never went over to her house again. Her dad didn't believe us. No one did, but I'll never forget it. Now, end quote. This is transitioning to this girl's, her father's encounter. This is not the friend and the horse farm father. This is the girl who was staying there for the sleepover. Her father. And I quote. Of course, I'll share my favorite story here, because it actually scared him, and he doesn't scare easily. He's a lumberjack kind of man. My dad, 52 male, walks the woods at night often, and he has insomnia, and the serenity of the woods, it helps. Sometimes he sings, plays his mouth harp, or reads if he brings a flashlight. So one evening, about 15 years ago, he went out walking. It's around 1 a.m., My grandparents, who we lived with, have property that backs up to a large cliff with a river below. So my dad walked out to the cliff to sit and watch the water. Now, if you walk along the cliffs a ways, there are remnants of an old bridge that you used to be able to cross the river with, but my dad just decided, okay, he's sitting up on the cliff's edge, playing his mouth harp, and he gets smacked in the face with a stone, palm-sized. But it hit him in the side of the face, coming from the direction of the bridge remnants, which was quite a ways off from him. He said he froze and stared out at the area but couldn't see anything. But then another stone flew past his head. Now, he said it scared him pretty good because it was so far away and had to have taken the strength to hit him from that far down. So my dad stood up and yelled, "You better leave me alone." And whatever it was took off through the trees but made a ton of noise leaving, like it was big. And that's when the hairs on my dad's neck stood straight up until it sounded far away. He walked the road home that night, which takes much longer than cutting through the woods. He's had other problems, like hearing an awful screaming that doesn't sound like a person, like an animal, but not one that you can place. He described it as almost a pained, sad cry. Now, he had other things thrown at him too, and I told him to stop going in the woods alone, but he won't listen. He's a stubborn old man. He's also seen what he claims is a Bigfoot-like creature eating a deer that he slew and had been looking for, and he couldn't find it initially, so he came in for lunch and went back out looking. He said he came across a drip trail that turned into a drag and kept following until he noticed the creature ahead. He stopped and backed away slowly behind a tree, but didn't want to go so far that he couldn't see it. Apparently, it munched on this deer for a solid 20 minutes or so before my dad just decided to leave. But what bothered him the most was that the creature didn't seem to notice my dad come up. but he wasn't being very quiet, so how could it not? Or was he just not concerned with him? Either way, my dad let him have the deer, end quote. Now, the girl's experience is quite something, and you have that rare but great scenario where you aren't alone for the experience. You have someone there to reaffirm what you saw for you. In this case, it sounds, I don't want to say friends off. It seems like they both believed, but she never visited the property again, and the friend's father probably didn't help either by sharing his denial of the encounter. You don't often hear about many encounters with other types of animals too. Dogs for sure, but horses, that makes it very unique because of the way it responded to the situation and got startled by this thing in the tree bucking them off. Thank goodness everyone was alright though, including the horse. Now, the girl's father, not the friends having the experience, is interesting. Going out in the woods alone, that's a special type of natural reset that many people are completely out of tune with these days. And forgive my own biased perspective here, I'm gonna be blunt, but so many people do not have healthy or proper connections to who they are inside. They live in a society, and the society these days is consisting of four walls with nothing but interconnection. It's not good. And of course, I'm being blunt about that. There's more things within these four walls. You got furniture and all the stuff that makes it a home, but human beings need that real face-to-face contact, and we need more of that than once or twice a year going out camping into the woods where you have all the utilities available to you. It's like going home in a way, and that home has now turned into a place where we're just tourists, just visiting. That home has become foreign to us, and yet that home is a home that has existed for us for however long the human race has been present on this planet. But I'll stop being a negative Joe Blow about it, but it's something that irks me for sure. This guy has it figured out, though. He's going out there, he's doing some soulful healing, often enough that he has piqued the interest of something else out there. Now, whether or not this thing was just passing through, or it is his territory, or the food is good, the game is good, and this thing just feels like there's something competitive going on, this guy doesn't strike me, based on the report, to be someone who is invasive or threatening, but someone who enjoys his time in a remote area, playing music and such. But we have to remember that even though you're in the woods playing the nice music and respecting the land, that these things aren't always all good. Like any animal, if you even want to associate Bigfoot as that, are subject to good days and bad days, like humans. You have ones that act on good and ones that act on bad. And in my own perspective, maybe this case is evident of that. A slight run-in with a bad attitude Bigfoot. In our first experience we talked about earlier, we're dealing with these things that seem to be much more negative, where they will take kids away, they will hurt people, and you need to be very careful about crossing them. So in closing, I stand by that. You should always be careful with animals and food. This creature probably didn't feel threatened much, but food is currency in the animal kingdom, and without it, you die. I've read a few reports where hunters track their target, and sure enough, not one but two hairy creatures step out, and then they realize, oh shoot, okay, like this deer that I was tracking was just avoiding these things. Is being hunted on two fronts by two different hunting parties. So I just crossed into something that is also engaging in the hunt. And there's so much more information we have to find out, and all we have are really just people's experiences to cross-reference and find possible points of truth in each one that can relate to each other, and we can build off of that. Of course, on top of all the footprints and other mysterious things that happen, the audible audio scenarios and whatnot. Like the father was talking about how there are some very wailing, painful cries, which coincides with other mysterious cryptid sightings and encounters. So it's just more evidence to the ever-expanding honey jar of stuff to talk about and associate with. But again, I digress. It's just, you got to remember to be careful out there. Don't feel like you are alone. While the stigma is very real, so is the compassion and understanding. And I think that it's not just in the cryptid community, but I hold on to the optimistic approach that a lot of humanity as a whole is there to listen and believe. And with that, everyone, you know where to find us. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Cryptid Clues. Again, thank you to you fine folks for allowing me to share these experiences. Really appreciate it. We'll be back next week with another episode, so stay tuned for that. Until then, everyone, take care and stay safe.